This is The Extraordinary Project. I'm Suzanne Cloris, and I want you to imagine something. You're on a weekend trip with your friend and her 3-year-old son in Kent, Connecticut. A picturesque end-of-summer getaway with woods and waterfalls and hiking trails. The 3-year-old son asks when you'll be picking raspberries that day, and you look at the mom who kind of rolls her eyes and shakes her head no. There aren't any raspberries this time of year, honey. There won't be any to pick. The mom explains to you. Earlier in the summer, on another northeastern vacation, she and her son had picked blackberries, and he was probably remembering that experience since some of them were red. But the boy wouldn't give up. He got angry. No, we're picking raspberries, he said. When are we picking raspberries? So the mom changed tack and led you all up a trail to a nearby farm where her son could pet the baby chicks. The boy was delighted within a few moments, holding each chick, learning about the different breeds from the lady farmer, who seemed to have taken a liking to you all. And then, out of nowhere, the lady farmer looked at the young boy and said, "Do you like picking raspberries?" Well, the little boy went bananas, and the mother went white, and the lady farmer led you over to a cascading bramble of bright red raspberries. It doesn't seem particularly odd to you that raspberries are growing late season in Kent, Connecticut, but it is a surprise that the little boy seemed to know that raspberry picking was going to be part of the agenda, even after his mom had said no. It's a little weird. It's like he knew. This story, written to me by a mother in Chicago, was just one of the many instances in which the 3-year-old either knew what she was thinking or knew some unknowable thing. I think that used to be called having a second sight. The Irish side of my family always talked about that skill as a real thing. And so did this mom. In her note, the mom marveled at the coincidence, but honestly wondered if the boy could have access to some future information stream beyond ordinary senses. I picked this story because it had to do with a child, someone too young to care about whether he could see into the future or not. But I had a lot of these stories in my collection. Coincidences that seem impossible, and they all get kind of complicated trying to figure out what might have been known about the area, what might have been discussed, and what was truly intuited. The bottom line question for me, though, is still the same. Can some people see into the future? Like, what's even the possibility of that? I should just admit something right away. I don't have a ton of answers from the last episode, but I do have an insight, and it relates to this raspberry story. All the storytellers were struggling just a little bit with memory. Memory is flexible. Every time you recall a memory, it changes slightly to fit your present context. Psychologists say we use memory as identity building blocks, and that's why we hold on to memories that we like and discard those that we don't. When incidents like the raspberry story happen to us, we remember them because they feel different. We might say, I had a déjà vu, or maybe we just keep the memory to ourselves because we're not sure. Maybe you're just remembering it wrong, or you just want it to be true. And because these experiences aren't widely understood, more often than not, we reject them, unless something about them is unshakable. This is Jennifer, a writer and former psych student in New York, who remembers this incident in a bar because of its uncanny timing.
We were having dinner at one of the cheap Indian restaurants on 6th Street, and this guy shows up who's friends with my friends. And I keep staring at him because he reminds me of someone that I used to know, but I can't figure out who.
And she could not stop staring all night, and she knew it was making him uncomfortable.
And so I finally tell him after 3 drinks, like, you remind me so much of someone I met like 10 years ago. This pyromaniac named Eros that I met at Burning Man.
You heard right. She said Burning Man. Jennifer is a burner. And you're free to think what you like about Burning Man, but one thing is true. You remember the people you meet in technicolor detail.
At Burning Man, sprite-like, puckish person, totally different from you, impressive writer person that I'm drunkenly rambling on to, because he's like super intuitive and into his body, and you're like super intellectual, but you both have a fake leopard fur coat and you both ride a bicycle and you both have these like amazing cheekbones and a like really strong horizontal linearity to your face.
To put it nicely, he was bewildered.
Whatever, it makes zero positive impression on him, and I sort of slink back to my corner of the karaoke room feeling slightly embarrassed. And then 20 minutes later, Eros walked into the karaoke bar. I was really absolutely flabbergasted because I hadn't seen him. I hadn't been in touch with him since he came to visit. We sort of had this momentary reconnection. Apparently, he hadn't been back in New York in a long time, and he was like, yeah, I was just thinking of you.
Maybe he was and maybe he wasn't, but she had just been thinking of him. That much we know. And in such detail. You can tell from those descriptions. The whole fur coat, bicycle riding, linear face description. That's a specific conscious awareness. Jennifer had a sense of her friend Eros moments before he appeared. And in normal life, everyone knows we can't predict the future. But Jennifer's detailed description makes me wonder, do we maybe just not have the evidence yet to support our reality? Our reality that maybe we all have the second sight. When I was younger, we'd visit my grandparents a lot. We'd drive up to the Hudson Valley, and my grandma, who was a very quiet, sweet Irish Catholic lady, she never drew attention to herself. Except once in a while she would say things like, I just knew. And she'd say them about events that she couldn't possibly know. The birth of a new grandchild, the health of her husband, someone's whereabouts, someone's safety. She said it with such a calm authority, and we all caught the implication, that she knew by other means, a sense that she was born with, or maybe that she inherited from her mother. We didn't talk about it much, but at the same time, we sort of deferred to her sense of knowing, or at least we trusted it within the family. That's partly why stories like the Raspberry story, or Jennifer's second sight, intrigue me. It's a little bit personal. There's a long history of doubt in our culture having to do with anything unidentified. What is it, we say? Did that even happen?
Unexplained natural phenomena now is being studied, but it was not recognized for many, many, many years that people were seeing.
That's Mark Rodiguier, Executive Director of the Center for UFO Studies. Rodiguier, who's been studying UFOs for more than 3 decades, has been listening to people tell their sighting stories, and he noticed this pattern. People see things, and then the larger culture assumes they're making it up, but then a new technology comes along, and whatever was being doubted is suddenly validated. Just like that. It didn't exist, now suddenly it does. It wasn't real for 100 years, and now suddenly it is. This cycle happened recently with sprites. Not the mythological creatures, but the lightning halos.
Things called sprites and blue jets, which are these things that appear over thunderstorms. And for years and years, pilots had reported them because they would look out in the distance with a thunderstorm 100 miles away. And they would see these light effects shoot upward when there was a lightning bolt that went downward. And nobody believed them because there was no evidence for this, no scientific evidence and no theory. But of course, it was real. And finally, with high-speed cameras, they were photographed, and then, science has been studying them for years, and it's an interesting phenomena in many ways.
So sprites were first reported in 1886, but not validated until 1989. Maybe we just need 103 years for our technology to catch up with our ability to sense the future. I found out it's actually almost been that long since the first psychic tests were done. Back in 1931, J.B. Rhine, founder of Duke University's Rhine Center for Parapsychology, shifted away from studying plants to devote himself to studying clairvoyance and telepathy and all things unknown. And Rhine used rigorous laboratory trials. He famously discredited Mina Crandon, a medium in Boston who enchanted New England artists and intellectuals with her elaborate seances. Rhine would not stand for frauds, and he pointed out her trickery, and that made Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, really, really mad. So mad that Doyle wrote and published an article in a Boston newspaper. It was titled, "J.B. Rhine is an Ass." But it didn't matter. Rhine had an even more important and well-respected supporter, the great anthropologist Margaret Mead. Mead was on the board of the Rhine Center, and Mead implored the science community to look closer at the limits of the mind we knew, and especially the mind we didn't yet know. So, why am I telling you this? Most people think there's no data and no history on extraordinary things. They think all of science denies it, and therefore their experiences aren't real. And that's just not true. And I keep thinking, what if we're missing out on a whole area of human experience just because we're too scared or too lazy to consider the facts? But how do you get the facts about predicting the future? Well, one way is by wondering and then Googling, like I did. I'd been working on a separate project. I hadn't started the Extraordinary Project yet. And this random thought floated through my head that I didn't have a good working definition of precognition or seeing the future or second sight. So I Googled, and up popped a study recently published in the Wall Street Journal and CBS News. The study had basically found that a form of second sight was real. They didn't use that language, of course. I called the scientist, and she broke it down for me. What's weird is, when I tracked her down, I figured at best we'd get a phone call, figuring she was working in Washington, D.C. or somewhere far away. It was a huge international study, after all. But it turned out she was at Northwestern. That was the university in my city. We ended up spending a lot of time together, and we sort of became friends.
So precognition is a general name for having a conscious, or sometimes non-conscious, awareness of a future event that would not normally be predictable.
That's Julia Mossbridge, one of the lead scientists of the study.
So for instance, if it looks like it's going to rain tomorrow, and you say, I think it's going to rain tomorrow, that's not precognition, that's just deduction, right? So precognition is usually something that we can only really show in the laboratory, because almost anyone could predict certain things through various subtle means if you're really good at, drawing connections between things.
I got to know her work better and learned that precognition has a range of close cousins. One of them, presentiment, the body's awareness of a future event, has been most studied most recently. She set up an experiment with college students, first years and sophomores who needed to fulfill research credit, and she asked them to look at 4 rather boring computer images, randomly selected. Then she asked them a crazy question, to choose which one was going to appear first.
And they were horrible at choosing which picture was going to show up. And that's great, because that matches our general experience, which is why that experiment sounds crazy, because we know that we can't predict the future, right? Like it's really hard. Some people can, but they're few and far between.
Hold on. Some people can? We'll get back to that. But first I want to get back to her experiment. Because although the students were terrible at predicting the future, she looked at their skin conductivity, and that told a different story.
So the conductivity of the skin is generally affected by sweat. So if I sweat more, my skin becomes much more conductive. So if I'm lying and I get nervous, my sweat pores are going to open even just a little bit, and then my skin conductivity will go up. So how much electricity is going through your skin?
It turns out that the changes in the students' skin conductivity 10 seconds before they were about to find out if they were correct showed whether or not they were correct.
So what does this mean? It means that 10 seconds before even the software program knows what it's going to choose, the body seems to know.
So to me, this was groundbreaking news. Our bodies can detect the future? Really? But it's actually old news. Mossbridge's study grew out of decades of prior research into the same idea, that the body seems to know. But the idea is still hard for the general public to accept. Since then, another behavioral study by Cornell psychology professor Daryl Bem found results that were similar and funnier, because his college students predicted porn 53.1% of the time, which is a lot. Late-night host Stephen Colbert had a field day with Bem's results when they came out.
Professor Bem suggests that subjects were able to sense the smut thanks to something called retroactive influence, meaning the pleasure of looking at naughty photos is so great it ripples backwards from the future to influence us in the present. That's right, folks. Science has finally discovered time travel.
Colbert asks Bem how time-traveling porn is even possible. And Bem answers honestly.
We have no idea.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Then Colbert asks Bem what made him even try this.
The belief that the future can be detected, it goes all the way back to the Old Testament.
Well, of course.
And about 60% of Americans believe that there are people who can do this.
Right.
And most psychologists say it's nonsense. Anyone who's lived through the 20th century as a physicist is accustomed to seeing phenomena that are just as weird as the phenomenon I'm showing, but people are more interested in porn. It doesn't require as much mathematics.
I guess when you're doing this kind of work, it's really important to have a sense of humor. But I want to go back to something that both Bem and Mossbridge said about those rare individuals who can detect future events consciously.
There's decades of research on these people who are actually consciously able to do this consistently at a rate above chance. But they are few and far between. It's like virtuoso soprano singers, for instance.
You have to have a natural gift.
Well, and practice, right?
So hearing her say this made me realize something about myself. I was actually on a quest for that type of person. But not because I want my future predicted, because I really don't. But some part of me needs to know, one way or another, if extraordinary experience has any connection to extraordinary ability. Like, do these stories show that we're all passive agents in these extraordinary moments? Or are we all on a spectrum of extraordinary ability? I became pretty narrowly focused on this quest, and I bugged Julia about it for a while, until she told me about a conference in Las Vegas, where a bunch of precogs gathered to bet on sporting events using a tried-and-true method of precognition called remote viewing. I had never heard of remote viewing, but when I looked it up, I saw that it had kind of a strange history. It had been developed and used by the U.S. Army for more than 2 decades. In fact, they had used it for intelligence gathering, and several of the people who worked in that program were going to be at the Vegas conference. Needless to say, I got on a plane. The Extraordinary Project was created by me, Suzanne Cloris. I wrote this episode and produced it with David Weiner, who wrote the music and made the mix sound so nice. Special thanks to the storytellers in this and last episode: the Center for UFO Studies, Julia Mossbridge, Daryl Bem, the Colbert Report, and all the private funders of the Extraordinary Project. For updates, questions, or contact information, visit theextraordinaryproject.net.